Hello, and welcome to Trade Talks, our regular series on all issues surrounding international trade. My name is Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And I'm pleased today to be joined by Michael Browne, who holds a chair in logistics and urban freight transport at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And prior to moving to Gothenburg in 2015, Michael worked for over 20 years at the University of Westminster in London, and you continue to chair the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, which we're going to have an occasion to talk about. And you teach courses in logistics and sustainability and retail logistics. So, and that's the focus of today's show. We're going to be talking about the last mile and city logistics and urban freight. Michael, one of the reasons that you're able to join us here today in California is that you're here for the International Urban Freight Conference, which is held every 2 years. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to be a specialist in this area?
Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks a lot for that. And you've certainly got a lot more sun and nice weather here than when I left London on my way from Gothenburg to get here. So thank you for the invitation. And as you say, I'm working in quite a specialised area, logistics and freight transport, particularly freight transport in the city. And I think my interest in that goes back till the late 90s, when we started to talk a lot more about energy use in transport. And we realised that most people were talking about energy use in transport, they were meaning by personal transport, cars, buses, this kind of system there. And they weren't really thinking about freight. So with a team in London, we started to put together some data on freight transport energy use in cities in London. And that really led us into a whole sort of series of work that we carried on doing after that, looking at urban freight questions.
It really is a field that's, I would say, has grown significantly over the past 10 to 15 years. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think to be fair, it's grown from a relatively small base. So, you know, at the conference that's being held here this week, you know, the attendance is very good. I think probably 200 or even a few more people than that will actually show up during the conference. And we've had the same kind of thing in the last few years at other events. And so I think that's really a big increase from the days of 30 or 40 people getting together to discuss the topic. And I think that's just it's a reflection of the growing awareness that freight in the city and how we deal with logistics for the cities now and in the future, that's just something that we've got a lot to learn from each other, and that we've got a lot to share between the researchers and those people who are interested in it, whether they be businesses or whether they be city authorities or whoever they are.
How different is urban freight than freight generally?
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways there are a lot of things that are the same. I mean, a lot of it is about a flow, a lot of it is about managing that flow, a lot of it is taking place in some kind of space and so on. I think where it's a bit different is that we've been really, really smart at getting a lot of efficiency into supply chains, particularly on longer distance journeys. So we've got tremendous efficiencies in how we consolidate flows onto ships and how we sort of can make pretty low energy trips per unit of product moved or per dollar of value moved in that sense. And then when it gets to the city, it's as if, well, that kind of disappears and everything fragments as it flows through to the end user, whether that's a shop, an office, or you and me ordering our groceries to be delivered to the home or packaged from Amazon. So I think it's really challenging to be in such a small space and actually make those kind of efficiency things happen, which we've been great at doing elsewhere.
I imagine the challenge in a place like London, which is particularly dense, the challenge of urban freight is even more acute than perhaps other places.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very busy city and there's never enough space to go round. I mean, sometimes I remember talking to somebody who's from one of the local boroughs in the city centre in London. They said, you know, if we want to change the use of the curbside here, we have to ask 57 different interest groups because all of them want to have something to do with this curbside. So I think London's a challenge, but of course, you know, other cities face different kinds of challenges. You know, there's a lot of cases we've got cities that are growing, some where the population's changing, some where we've got a lot of regeneration, and some where we've got a lot of land that's now was being used for an industrial purpose before, and now it's going to change again. I think London's interesting because it's big and it's well known, but there's a lot of places that are having the same questions.
Tell us a little bit about the Central London Freight Partnership, though, and how that grew up, because I think that's a useful lesson for other places where, as you suggested, the challenges are similar.
Well, it started from an idea that arose in Britain anyway, back in about the late 1990s, which was that the city authorities or local authorities needed to get together with businesses and talk to each other more, because they just didn't understand each other's position very well from the public sector and the private sector. And so this idea of having freight quality partnerships in cities and even in towns around Britain grew up. And in about in about 2005 in London, they thought, well, wouldn't it be good to have one in the centre? So it brings together the central London boroughs. So that's a number of them that come together in the centre, like Westminster, the City, Kensington and Chelsea, others around there. They come together to discuss freight-related issues with, if you like, their opposite numbers in the private sector, from retailing, from the carriers like UPS, DHL, and also then with other interested groups. So we have a Freight Transport Association that represents the industry and so on. So they've been coming together since 2006. I chaired it when it was set up, and I've carried on doing that. And they've come together to talk 4 times a year about what are the problems, what can they do, can they work together on some solutions, and in a way also to say, well, what's the gap between the public and private sector? Because I know we talked a little bit about what we would discuss today, and I said to you that I think at the first meeting which I chaired of this group, I thought, oh great, I'm an academic, I'm getting involved with this group of people, this will be a good discussion. And in fact, I mean, it would be better if I was a referee, really, because there was a lot of animosity about the parking fines for penalties for being in the wrong place. And so over time, that's really, the discussion's changed a lot, and people are able to listen better to each other's point of view and think about where maybe they can join it up a little bit more.
The discussions have gotten better, but have the challenges become even more problematic with the advent of e-commerce and the fact that now each of us as an individual consumer is one of those stakeholders that has to be considered?
I think that's a very good point. I think it has got better, but at the same time we've got just as many, if not more, challenges. The whole way that cities, in the time that it's been running, people have become much more aware that the population of London, for instance, is growing quite significantly, that we've got big infrastructure projects happening across London which take up a lot of road capacity and put challenges out there for the transport operators that have to serve the businesses that they're working with. And at the same time as that, we've got this rise in e-commerce, delivery to homes and also delivery to offices for people's personal products, which are quite often going to the office buildings for that. And so, there's just as many things to solve in 2017 as there were in 2006. If not more. And my hope would be that maybe the good thing would be that we're a bit better at least having a good dialogue about how could we get to a discussion that's more meaningful about them.
Yeah, I've heard you talk in the past about sort of the need to match the flow of things with the flow of vehicles, and that becomes really difficult when a lot of more individuals are creating the demand for the services.
And also, I mean, I think we've seen this rise of what some people have called instant deliveries, so things that are delivered within 2 hours of you ordering it, or perhaps even less. And there it is difficult to optimize these flows. And I think that for policymakers, that's also difficult, because if you're trying to make the regulations and the rules and the policies for your city or for your part of the city, or even for a small part of the city, then it's difficult. What are you worried about? Are you worried about the vehicles that come there? But the vehicles are only coming there because of the things that they're carrying. And so maybe we have to look always one level up from the vehicle and think about the system and why is it there? What is it that it's carrying? What's changing in the upstream chain? Right,
the goods are generated from somewhere and they have to get there before. And it's always interested me that in this the revitalization of our urban cores, the focus for people is on the quality of life in urban centers, which for many people eliminates logistics from the equation. But in fact, you would think that logistics behind the scenes makes it all possible.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's interesting if you look at an image of the city and you just see buildings and you see some people, you don't think about all the things that are going into the buildings and all the things that people are going to be using that day, which have come there somehow. And I think particularly when we talk about livability, often we sort of connect that with new ways to move around. So I won't necessarily have a car if I'm living in the middle of the city. I won't commute to the middle of the city by car. So it will be a big change in the pattern of our own travel patterns. And in order for that to work, we'll actually have to rethink how we handle freight transport as well, because we could see a reduction in car use, but actually an increase in the number of deliveries that have to be made to people who are living now in the city without a car, but still need the same things as they needed before. And I think we haven't really thought that through in a lot of cases. We sort of we don't see the connection between our own personal mobility and the world of freight.
Right. The demand for fresh cut flowers, being available to us, all of the restaurants and shops and boutiques. That's we help create that challenge, that problem. I want to talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing with a program called the Urban Freight Platform in Gothenburg, and maybe looking at some of those new solutions that you're talking about to respond to the changing nature of mobility. What are you seeing? What innovative solutions have you seen, maybe from the European context or from your travels elsewhere?
Well, maybe I could just say briefly about the Urban Freight Platform.
Yeah, please.
Just to say that, this is an initiative which we started in Gothenburg, working between the University of Gothenburg, which is a typical large university with a lot of different disciplines, and Chalmers University, which is focusing much more on technology and on the engineering side of things. So it's a great collaboration with some support from the Volvo and educational foundations in this.
Which we're familiar with.
Which also is supporting work here in
Southern California through the Metro Freight program, right?
And will be featured some of the research will be featured at the conference. So, it was an opportunity to start something in Gothenburg where we felt we could, that if we worked together with the different researchers, we could get a lot more out of our work than if we worked always separately, in a sense. And so we've tried to create something to increase the dialogue within Gothenburg, but then wider than that, to involve other people from other Swedish universities and across Scandinavia, and also to involve people who not just from the academic side, to involve business people and wider, and the policymakers. So that's why I've come up with this title, Urban Freight Platform, in a sense to say, well, it's a kind of link or somewhere that we can discuss things which are important.
And suggesting that some of the innovation is not just about the technology or the way we move goods, but how we solve the problems.
Yeah, I think you and I've talked a little bit before about it, and I think that it's very much about thinking about a system. You can have a very perfect technical solution, but if the organization bit doesn't work, then the perfect technical solution won't work either, or won't be sustainable in some way. And equally, you can have a great idea about organization, but if the technology isn't robust enough, then or we're not really thinking about it in the right way, then that won't work. So I guess within the Urban Freight Platform, we're interested in trying to be just making one of those things which is a contribution to taking good ideas and putting them into practice, or understanding a bit more about where are we lacking some research that could be very valuable from a practice point of view.
And about that practice, where do you see the innovative solutions? Is it in the size of the vehicles? Is it in the policy? Is it in new technology? What makes a city work from an urban delivery perspective?
I think it would be great if there were a sort of one or two simple solutions that we could say, well, if only these bits just could come along, we could actually apply them, and everything would, we'd all be happier about that. But I think it's the challenge at the moment, or the problem is to really try and work out how these things will be combinable. So, for instance, there's been a lot of emphasis on the use of small vehicles in urban centres in some of the European projects, which I think your team here have also looked at because of the connections between the different research groups that are involved in these networks now. And small vehicles are a solution for some of the flows within the city centre, and we should really promote that, and we can use electrically assisted pedal bikes, and we can use new types of technology. In Gothenburg, there's a small delivery system called Stadsleveransen. That's probably not how you pronounce it if you're from Gothenburg, but anyway, that's my best go at it. And these kind of small vehicles have a role in the city, but what we shouldn't think is that they are the only solution. We have to see them in combination with the other things that we need to move on. So, for instance, for construction projects, we may need to face the fact that we do need larger vehicles, or at least larger unit loads. And there we need to look at different opportunities. Maybe we can use the water for some of that. So in Gothenburg, we've got some projects going on to think about the use of the water system for construction traffic, the use of the small vehicles for serving the parts of the city which are more sensitive to that. And I think our hope and our goal is to learn from those projects and share them with other people and learn from other people about them.
Do we need to design differently? You know, sort of our buildings, our streetscape, that sort of thing.
I think that's, for me, a very fundamental question, that there is a mismatch between how we plan and design for cities and the space in cities compared with how we then use them. So you asked a question before about the livability of cities, and you made the connection. You said, well, the livability also does have the connection with the freight and logistics side of things. But we're not designing for the freight and logistics side of things when we're designing even new spaces. And then when we have the challenge of the reuse of space, so what used to be maybe, well, the most obvious example, for instance, comes from London examples. In the past, it was very common for there to be a bank on the corner of many busy streets. This was the most expensive location. Only banks could afford to be located there. Of course, what's happened over time is that we don't need as many banks anymore because of the internet and changes in how we do business. So these sites become vacant, and very often they're taken over by restaurants. And in a restaurant, what do you need? You need deliveries. And some of them will have quite a number of deliveries every day. And these are in the very place where you don't want deliveries, right at the corners of busy streets. So, it's very difficult to think about the design of those places. You could retrofit things to that, but what's a bit frustrating is when you look at the way that maybe office space is designed, and we're not really adapting the design to cope with the change in office space. Again, with multi-tenanted office buildings, you can be generating several hundred trips a day to even a middle to large sized office building, because each tenant is going to be ordering their own products, each one is having their archives taken away, each person is ordering their catering for the function that they've got. So we need to think about how the buildings will be used when we design the space for the logistics and freight activity that will be behind it.
And even our apartment buildings are becoming many sort of Amazon storage facilities, in the lobbies. It's a big challenge.
Yeah.
And of course, you can make that corner space a no parking or loading zone, but if the delivery has to occur, the truck's going to go there anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a very service-oriented business in logistics, and if they're told, if somebody has ordered something and it's to be delivered, then someone will find a solution to that, and the solution, may work well enough to get that it happens. You get the delivery, but the cost of it, the real cost of that, is much higher than trying to solve the problem in a better way right from the beginning. So,
why don't we do more deliveries in the middle of the night when there aren't as many conflicts, say, for example, as there would be in the middle of the day?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you've got some good examples of things being done at night. I know that one of the most widely discussed in the urban freight community is the initiatives in New York, in New York City, to deliver in the so-called off hours.
Right.
And I know that's been widely sort of picked up by other people, and people have looked at how you could try and do the same thing. I mean, it's definitely got a role, because if you can shift the time, then you can take these vehicles out of the peak flow, which has a big help in terms of traffic movement in the peak period of the thing. But it's also got some challenges, so that if we think about it for small businesses, for instance, then the small business owner maybe doesn't want to be in their store in the middle of the night or 3 a.m.
Right.
And then you get back to the question which you raised earlier, Tom, which was to sort of say about a technology solution, because if we could come up with smarter ways to actually make the delivery secure, whether that be through some kind of secured delivery drop-off point, or some way that you can give people access, but only those people can have access, and you can have a record of that access in some way, then the sort of unattended delivery could play a bigger role. Yeah,
I think one of the innovations that I think we're just starting to see come to the U.S. that was pioneered in Europe is the direct-to-fridge delivery, right? Where you grant secure access via your smartphone for somebody to deliver your fresh produce to your refrigerator.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also interesting, because for me, it's difficult sometimes to see how we should join up the different areas. So something like direct to fridge, well, it's direct to fridge, but what's the difference between that and direct to filing cabinet? Not that filing cabinet's used,
Right.
or direct, how could we do some of those things? And then if we could coordinate that so that it's not only direct to your fridge and my fridge on the next person in the next apartment, but the whole building kind of coordinates that. And just as if the tenants in a multi-tenanted office building could coordinate some of their flows, we could start to have a very big impact, I think, because the volumes would go up and we'd actually be able to see the whole picture much more easily. And I think what at the moment's happening is we're solving little bits of problems here and there and creating rules here and there, and I think that's not the best way to do it.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, solutions, and the innovations in a European and North American context, but I know you've had an occasion to observe urban freight in other places, Africa and Asia. What can we learn from those experiences?
Yeah, I think I would say that I've seen a number of these things, and I've certainly read about a lot more of them and been in presentations made around them. And I think there are some people who have much more experience of that. And I think one of the things that I hope will come out of this Volvo Research and Education Foundations initiative is that with the bigger networks that we've got now working on urban freight, it will be possible to share and transfer some of the lessons from different places. And it's for certain that if you look in some countries, then the sort of the networking at an informal level between people and the sort of mix between mobility and freight movement is much greater than we see in a typical West European or North American city environment for freight. So, freight is for freight vehicles, and freight is not part of somebody's informal network in terms of moving it around. But some of the initiatives that we read about now as being very new about crowd shipping, well, you can find examples of that in other countries which have been going on for decades, in fact.
Right.
And the same with this quite well-known case study about food delivery in India, about people taking their fresh lunch boxes to the offices and other places, again, without any IT support. But so I think about organisation, we can learn something, and about networks, and about how you can support those networks to achieve something. I think those are the things we can definitely learn.
Michael, you mentioned the diversity of regulatory responses and how they're adopted city by city, section by section. How much of a part of the equation is our willingness to accept those regulatory responses that could very well impact our consumer behavior and our choices?
Yeah, I think maybe the first thing is to say that a lot of regulation in the city is aimed very specifically at the transport operator. And I think that's a problem. And a line that I remember from talking with transport operators in London was, why don't you plan it, not ban it? Because, banning and restricting things is one way of doing something, but maybe we could plan it better. But I think the problem with just focusing on the transport operator is that it misses the role that they're playing in the chain. And so the people receiving the products, whether that's a business, a retailer, a restaurant, office building, or it's you and me, or everybody receiving the product in the community, we're actually setting our own rules. My rule is, if you like, I want it by 9 o'clock, and my rule is I want it tomorrow, my rule is I want it in 2 hours, whatever the rule happens to be. And sort of overlaying the kind of behavior of the transport operator with another set of regulations that says, well, you can do anything you like, but you mustn't be there at this time, will lead to some very perverse effects. So, for instance, regulatory effects often don't go in line with what people expect. We restrict big vehicles and people substitute 2 small ones. We restrict the times and people will put 2 vehicles onto the same work at just before the time ban comes in. So I think we've somehow got, going back to your question, if we're looking at a really big explosion in the number of deliveries to homes, whether that be private houses or apartment buildings, then we've got to think about getting people to think about how they're part of the supply chain now.
Right.
And I think that if we do that, if we can give people this information, maybe they can think about when they order, how urgent is it really? Maybe they can think about where the product is to be left. For instance, in Gothenburg, where I'm living now and working, I'm really struck by how many people have the packages delivered to a collection point and they pick them up on their way home. So that in fact you have another kind of queuing, which is when you queue in the collection point behind everybody else at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening going to collect your package, but you've done it on foot. So in that sense, it's not having a traffic impact. So I think restrictions and rationing of the number of deliveries, I don't really think that's going to be a very workable solution. I think awareness, behavior change, some guidance, some websites that can allow you to share information, better flexibility in where the product is delivered. I think those are the more productive solutions.
Right, and probably understanding the true costs and benefits of the structures we
have
now.
And seeing the costs as being quite wide, so that if my delivery means that there are trucks backed up on the street where I live with other people, then I need to think about that in terms of my children's going to school or my neighbour's children going to school and walking there or cycling there and so on.
Well, this is a fascinating discussion. We're going to take a short break,
Okay.
And when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the exciting examples that you're familiar with, where city logistics and cooperation played a critical role, and that was the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, which certainly has lessons for those of us here in Southern California. We'll be right back with Trade Talks.
The Center for International Trade and Transportation at Cal State Long Beach is celebrating 20 years of academic activity and service in the goods movement industry. CITT brings together different sectors of the global supply chain through the efforts of the Policy and Steering Committee. Among the important industry stakeholders represented on the committee are the beneficial cargo owners, or BCOs, including manufacturers.
For the BCOs and the manufacturers to be involved with CITT, it gives us the foresight that we need to plan our supply chains. And with the way that CITT facilitates partnership between stakeholders that would not necessarily all be sitting at the same table, they make improvements possible through those friendships that they build.
CITT looks forward to enhancing the next 20 years of trade and transportation.
Welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien, and my guest is Michael Browne, who holds a chair in logistics and urban freight transport at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you.
Before the break, we were talking a little bit about the changing nature of our urban form and logistics, particularly in city centers. But you were also referencing sort of broader supply chain trends that impact all of this. How much is what we see in our city center a response to what's happening outside of the core?
Yeah, that's one of those questions that maybe seems simple to ask, but quite difficult to have a good answer to. But I clearly a lot of what ends up in the city as a consumer product of some sort or another, whether it's consumed by a business or an individual, has come from some kind of long-distance supply chain, even from a global supply chain. And I can see from my hotel window here in Long Beach, you can see the port, and it's a huge area, and this is generating huge traffic flows. And cities and ports have been connected together for centuries. And I think that so far we talked mainly about the flows, which, if you like, we think of in the city centre, the downtown area maybe of the city. But clearly there are a lot of other flows which are around and about the city, or which start outside the city and come into it. And we need to find ways to sort of think about the connection between these longer distance flows and the city, because maybe it's appropriate sometimes for those flows to go directly to the city, but maybe it's often appropriate to have some kind of transshipment or consolidation activity. And I think that understanding that the city is at the end and the beginning of the supply chain is valuable in terms of thinking about what that means for policies and what that also means for how we design for that in the future.
Right, it's the first and the last mile.
Yes, definitely. I think that's right.
And we don't often think about it in terms of logistics, but that, refuse and waste, that's part of the process as well.
Absolutely. And I think also in that you can include service trips, which are also part of the logistics activities. So, the trip to fix the photocopier, to clean to put the plants in the building, to come and, a big problem for stores is if the cash desk system goes down or they have some kind of IT problem, the store has to close. So we're very dependent on technologies, and to fix those things we need service activity, and services are a big part of the flow in the city in that sense.
Yeah. There's also a lot of sort of uncertainty in both sides of the Atlantic about trade in general.
Yeah.
Uncertainty about protectionism and things of that nature. What impact does that have on the last mile, if at all?
I mean, probably it has some impact. I mean, there's an impact if the economy changes. Urban freight follows the economy to quite a large extent, so that in times of recession, we see a fall in the flows. In fact, the fall in the flow of the products isn't mirrored entirely in the flow of the vehicles, because you tend to you get a situation where what happens is you have worse vehicle utilization. So it's not like, oh good, there's a downturn in the economy, the congestion problem's gone away completely. That won't be what happens. But uncertainty over the trade side of things, if that makes the economy less confident, I think the bad side about that is it will postpone decisions about investment and in building, in infrastructure development, and in putting money into things that we need to put it into, like upgrading the vehicle fleet, making sure that we keep up with the technology changes, which I think everybody agrees are pretty dramatic. So I think it's not just about trade and the uncertainty, it's the knock-on effect of that for cities is potentially the problem.
Right, and logistics is a lot about being proactive and not reactive, the planning function, and that coordination is important. Well, speaking of planning and coordinating, I want to talk a little bit about the role that logistics played in a successful 2012 Summer Olympics in London. And I want to talk about it partly because it's part of the work that you did with the Freight Partnership, but also it's something that could be a useful lesson to Paris and Los Angeles, which will be hosting the 2024 and 2028 games. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the story of the development of the partnership around the 2012 games.
Yeah. Well, I guess that the thing that's interesting if you work in transport of all sorts, including freight transport, is just how transport related the Olympic Games have become over time. So that there's a big discussion always about each Olympic Games about how will the transport system function in terms of getting the athletes and the officials to and from the games venues,
and the media,
and all this other big thing, and plus how will people get there? How will the spectators get there? How will all the people who want to take part in the event get there? And so transport's become a huge part of it, and the logistics of the games themselves, the events and so on. Again, that's a big thing. It's much written about in case studies about how I think it's UPS have dealt with that in the last few and so on. And so it was no different in London. And I think we started off this discussion, and you made the point that, well, London's a big city, it's very congested, it has a lot of traffic problems. And of course that was one of the things that was said about the games. Well, they just won't be able to make the traffic work properly in London for people to get to and from the games. So, right from the early stages of winning the right to hold the Olympics in 2012, people knew there was going to be a change to the road network. And I think what was interesting to be there and to work a little bit with Transport for London, who took responsibility for managing all of that process. They're the strategic transport authority for London, for the Greater London area. What was really interesting was to see the way they could see that you could have a kind of successful games from the point of view of people getting to and from the games, the spectators. You could do the thing with the road network, but you might actually have a real logistics problem if the restrictions on the road network meant that people couldn't manage the day-to-day logistics of the city. So that started to get recognized from, I would say, 2 years or so before 2012, so 2010, something like that.
Was there a particular trigger point that...
No, I think it was just awareness. People realized that there would be road restrictions. The road restrictions would involve restrictions on loading and parts of the road network that would be not in use for commercial vehicles making delivery trips at different times of the day. And it led to, as I say, it led Transport for London to become aware that there was potentially a problem about the day, how do you keep London going during the period of not just of the Olympic Games, but the Paralympic Games, which follow soon afterwards, and other events around that. And the Games are not just the Games, because you also have this pattern where now people go and watch a lot of the things on live screens in different parts of the city. And indeed the road network is given over to things like the marathon and cycle racing and other kinds of things. So there was an awareness that freight was definitely an issue in London. And I think it was really interesting how Transport for London stepped up to dealing with that and trying to get the message across to people about that there would be needs to change things.
And Transport for London is a public authority?
Yes, they're the public body that takes a strategic responsibility for managing transport managing all the public transport in London, so that's the underground or metro system and the bus system, and regulating taxis, and also they take responsibility for the strategic road network. So that's the proportion of the roads that carry most of the traffic, where the heaviest flows are.
And was it Transport for London that brought everybody to the table, or did the logistics provider say, hey, we foresee a problem coming, how are you going to address our concerns?
Yeah, I think both ways round. I mean, Transport for London had already started to become interested in freight transport actually since for 10 years before that, because they'd set up a London Sustainable Distribution Partnership in 2001 following the election of the mayor for London in that year. And so freight was something that featured on their radar, but they really sort of decided that they needed to get a much more engagement with the industry. And I think it was both sides talking about this together. So one part is the operators saying we need to know, and the other side was Transport for London realizing they need to tell operators what was going to happen and how they could plan for it. So I think at the heart of what changed in the run-up to the 2012 Olympic Games was all about the awareness about and the ability to engage between the public sector and the private sector, because it's not sort of like, it's not every day that the public sector and the private sector are talking to each other about some of these things.
And I know that's the case here as well, that there's a clear awareness of the need to work together, but when it comes time to share data, that's when you sort of get challenges, right? Particularly the private sector might be less likely to do that or more hesitant.
Yeah.
Was that the case with the Olympics?
Definitely. And I think what's interesting is that what made a change, and I think was an interesting phenomenon, was that, well, Transport for London realised they needed to get more engagement going. So they worked a lot at holding workshops and discussing with the private sector about what needed to be done. And they created a freight forum where they could invite people from the freight transport sector to come to it. And the freight transport people explained to the mob at that time that, well, it wasn't just their decisions that mattered, it was the decisions of their customers. And so, in a sense, they were able to use some of this to talk with the customer groups. So, for instance, a big generator of freight trips are things like wholesale markets, where you get fruit and vegetables, fish, meat. They were part of the customer group, if you like, who could discuss this. They made a big push to retime some of the trips. And in retiming, it's not a matter just for the transport operator to say, oh, we're retiming it. You need to have the customer involved in that. And again, Transport for London were able to, if you like, use this as part of the reason to have that dialogue.
I've heard you talk about the concept of reduce, retime, reroute, right?
Yes.
That grew out of this experience.
Yes, I mean, that was the Transport for London message, which was picked up and used, and we would discuss this also in the Central London Freight Partnership, just in the city centre itself. But this idea to say, okay, there's a complicated message here about the road network and about all kinds of things people know about, off-hours delivery, the retiming, whatever you want to call it. But we need to get a good communication plan together. And I think Transport for London worked hard at that. And I think that having, as you just said, reducing the number of trips, how could you reduce them? Could you group some things together? Could you maybe order some of the servicing of the lifts in advance? Could you do something to reduce the total number? And if you can't reduce them, can you retime them? Can you shift them out of the bit when there's most pressure on the network? And then if you can't do that, and you've still got to go, well, can you revise, maybe you can reroute in some way. And a small amount of work was also put into thinking about changing the mode. So maybe some things you can drive in, park, and then walk a little bit. Maybe you have to walk a little bit further to carry the product for packages and so on.
This was at a time sort of e-commerce was prevalent, but not to the extent it is today. That's ballooned in the past few years. Would the system, do you think, have been able to accommodate the changes in demand needed for e-commerce deliveries?
I think you're right. The numbers have certainly gone up. I mean, interestingly, they did include delivery to the home in their messages that went out and in their sort of attempt to engage. But it's clearly one challenge to engage with the hundreds and small thousands, let's say, of decision makers. Maybe there's thousands of decision makers in the freight sector, let's say, who have some role, and there are millions of consumers. So to have a communications campaign that engages with them is definitely difficult. But I think the principles are the same. You know, you've got to think about what the message is and about what it is you're trying to get people to change. And then you have to be reasonably consistent in finding ways to do that. And of course, the advantage for Transport for London and those who were committed to this was that there was this very focused effort on the Olympic Games. It was going to happen, it wasn't going to go away, and that gave people a very good motive to actually discuss it. Whereas I guess in a sort of day-to-day environment of business, you think, well, yeah, it's very important, but oh well, you know, there's a meeting in a couple of months' time. You know, that the deadline helped in that sense.
Was it all carrot, no stick, or were there penalties tied to not complying?
There were, I think under the regulation things, there were probably penalties, but in fact the penalty side of it never surfaced very much. It was all about working together to make something work efficiently. And I think they learnt a lot. I think a lot was learnt on both sides. One was about, on the side from the private sector side, I think it gave an insight into the willingness of a public authority to really engage with freight transport in the city. And I think that's an important lesson, that somebody is listening. Somebody at the top of the organisation was listening. Effectively the chief executive of Transport for London. He spoke at many events and chaired many meetings, but he was supported by a team of people in his organisation who were able to make a difference to that and knew what the industry side of things were doing. And I think that level of trust that came out of that was an important step in making a difference.
And were there other innovations on the technology side that helped? Was it information sharing, new technologies that played a role?
I mean, perhaps not maybe as many as you might think, and perhaps there would be more now. I mean, perhaps there were, maybe people did write apps for some of these things, but I don't remember that particularly being a big thing, and perhaps that would change now. But one way that I remember that they managed to provide information in a more usable way was that clearly with a thing like the Olympic Games, you know what events will be on each day. You can predict the number of spectators, plus or minus with the weather, which of course is not always the same in London. And you can then produce a kind of traffic or heat map, if you like, of where the congestion will be. So for every day of the Games and the Paralympic Games, Transport for London produced, if you like, congestion maps showing people where the heaviest traffic flow would be. So a planner in an office could look at this and they could say, oh, well, this is a really serious problem today. Or maybe they could say, actually, you know, Tuesday and Wednesday are going to be a lot better than Thursday and Friday. So maybe we should think about doing something just 1 or 2 days earlier in the week than we normally do it in that part of London. So, I mean, that was an application of technology, but they didn't directly feed that information from my memory anyway, they didn't directly feed that information into the planning system. But I mean, you could do that now, I think. You know, I think if there was a willingness to do that, I think there would be the possibility to push this data, and more we'll be able to do that in real time, I think, in the future.
And I would have to think that the availability of that data and that knowledge would be critical from a security perspective, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just the safety of the athletes and the people who are moving in through the city, but logistics plays a role. The deliveries are you know.
No, I think that's a very good, very important question. The visibility of things and awareness of what's out of the ordinary becomes more and more important. Yeah.
Now, of course, the million-dollar question is how much of this has been institutionalized, and is it still the case? Is this cooperation happening? Or the flexibility occurring?
Yeah. Now that is a good question, and I think if you look at some of the presentations that were made by people in Transport for London after the Games, they were able to demonstrate this shift of time. For instance, with the vehicles, you could actually see that the morning peak, the morning movements of the freight vehicles, particularly the vehicles that were bigger than the van-sized ones, so the trucks, let's call them, those did come earlier in the day, and therefore the peak in the normal peak period was lower than the normal peak. So they effectively changed that behaviour. They knew from surveys that they had managed to reduce the amount of transport activity, and people had changed something about what they did. And you know, in an ideal world, all of those things would have gone on just as they were and would have been even reinforced. But I think it's fair to say that in quite a lot of those cases, the particular initiative that was taken, if you like, went back to more or less the pre-Games way of doing it after the Games. So I don't think everybody's behaviour suddenly changed and, oh, now we're in a new place. What I think it did show, though, was that, oh, you could change this. So that gave a lot of encouragement to working out, okay, well, if you can change it for an event, how can we institutionalise that? So, for instance, Transport for London realised that it was probably better to try and set up a bigger initiative, like and they've called it, I think, the retiming initiative. So to work with the kind of companies that could retime successfully, that could be earlier. So, you know, not trying to get everybody to do it, but trying to get those people who could do it to do it in that way. And I think the biggest thing that they clearly also learned was that the key to this was engagement between the public sector and the private sector. And that's continued. They still have the Freight Forum now. They run it regularly, at least 2, sometimes 3 times a year if there's a particular thing to talk about. And they've used that kind of body to discuss what they know will be difficult questions for the freight sector, like the ultra-low emission zone in central London, which will require investment in newer vehicles in some cases to meet the standards that are called for that. So they've had that discussion in a forum with people who are not going to agree with it necessarily, who might challenge or question it. And I think that kind of dialogue and discussion has been maintained.
And it seems it doesn't even have to be at that large a scale. Even the placement of a speed bump, right, which has people think is a perfectly good reason to implement them for neighborhood safety and security, but we don't think about the impact it has on trucks and vans.
No. So I think, you know, that maybe the sort of perhaps the slightly jargony way to talk about it would be to say that some of the hard measures haven't necessarily stayed, but they've been, if you like, built into a series of softer measures which have led to changes, you know, have contributed to the change in behaviour. But it's not a perfect. It's not like this fixed. Oh, there's no problems after 2012. There are no freight problems in London. It's all solved. Of course, it's not like that. But it was a big step for the people involved.
And I imagine that's a valuable lesson for a place like Paris or Los Angeles. Is what if the organizing committees asked for your suggestions on how to approach engagement with the logistics sector in the run up to those games, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd say that you do need you can't leave it until just 2 years before the games. I mean, I think if people looked at this from outside, they might look and they might say, well, oh, it seems like Transport for London step up a lot of this activity 2 years before the games. You start to see a lot more workshops and other events. But those were possible because they already had a group of people, a small group of people, admittedly, but a group of people who were really working a lot on freight transport questions. And that group had been steadily growing since 2001, when they'd first started to engage with freight within London in that sense, going beyond just a regulatory role in their engagement. So I would say, you know, don't leave it too late. Make sure you need people who are able to communicate and deal with and work with those in the freight sector, and then support them. And that support needs to be right from the very top, because one of the lessons from London for me was that the person in the public sector who was responsible, Sir Peter Hendy, you know, he gave support from the top to this initiative, but he had support from the people in his organisation. They had the skills to actually make that engagement work.
And I would imagine you'd also need leadership on the freight sector side to say, hey, it's good for us to be at the table, so we're not regulated in a way that we can't live with or accommodate.
Absolutely, and also a willingness to you have to also have a willingness to see another person's point of view and to think, okay, that, you know, this is going to happen, we've got to change something about it. And I think it's good that, for instance, this freight forum that I've mentioned is always chaired by someone from the private sector. So Transport for London created it, organised it, but the chair of the meeting will be a private sector representative. So it's a kind of way of showing that it's a two-way connection in that sense.
Is there something that didn't work particularly well, or that you think, say for example, Los Angeles could do differently in hindsight?
No, I think it's a hard. It mostly worked. I mean, people were very happy. It's a high point in in Britain being reasonably at ease about itself and enjoying it, and it was seen, I think, quite widely as a great success. And on the more technical level of what happened with transport, well, it was not the disaster that everybody said it would be. It was far, far, far from that. I think that maybe if they had had more resources, they could have captured even more of what was changed and somehow tried to sustain that for longer. I think so much effort went into trying to make it a successful thing that, not surprisingly, afterwards some of the things fell away without that support. So maybe one could look into the sort of, if we can make people change through engagement and behaviour change, do we need some incentives to keep them going after that? Or are there sort of things that we could think about in the run-up to it that could have made them more long-term? Right. So I would say focus on it early is important. Use what's already out there. There's a lot of experience out there from the people who were involved in it. And then already you should be thinking about the beyond part.
Beyond. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of beyond, as we're getting ready to wrap up, I want to talk about the future of urban freight transport. What do you see the impact of transformational technologies on urban deliveries? We haven't talked about drones, but what about drones, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing? Everyone's sort of predicting these are the game changers.
Yeah.
Are they game changers for urban freight as well?
It's for sure they'll have some kind of an influence, even if the influence is just in terms of requiring attention and people creating scenarios in which we think about what will happen, and whether it's any one of them or whether some of it's in combination. So the vehicles delivering and the drone question at the same time. I think that's potentially an interesting initiative. And certainly with autonomous vehicles, I think that also brings together the topic that we talked about right at the beginning, which was about the connection between personal mobility and freight trips. If we have an autonomous car, what's to stop me sending my car to go and get the shopping for me? Right. And that, in a sense, might at the moment be a freight trip that's coming on a van or in some other way. So, that what it does, some of this technology will do, is some of it will change the line between what is freight and what isn't freight.
That's interesting.
And I think the only thing I'd say is that in the city we think a lot about movement, because in freight transport and in transport generally, mostly we focus on movement. But in fact, a lot of the activity to do with freight transport in cities is tied up with something that's either static or actually involves walking, so that a lot of packages, for instance, are delivered by people on foot, and the amount of moving going on is quite limited in the system. The vehicle doesn't move very far. It's there as a sort of little mobile warehouse, if you like, while it's going around. So I think the way the technologies work will be not quite like we see them at the moment, so but much more complicated. I think the interesting thing is that this change is unpredictable, and people talk a lot about disruptive technologies and disruptive change. But in a way, the good thing at the moment is that it's focusing more attention on the topic of urban freight. It's made it more relevant to more people. And I think as a researcher, I'm aware of that because of the number of organizations that contact us, and I'm sure that's true of all the colleagues who you work with, and if we did a survey at the conference tomorrow, I guess we'd find that most people there find that they get more questions now from outside about what's happening, what should they do, where can they find out about this.
And what you're saying suggests that in the discussion about solutions, we need to sort of broaden the set of people who are interested in this topic. We need to look at people who design spaces, the landscape architects, the city planners, in a way that they're engaged in this discussion. So that core group of 30 or 40 that's become 200 is expanded even further.
Yeah, that's, I think, absolutely the case. And I think that something we'd certainly like to work on in Gothenburg for the next couple of years would be to expand that. So we will host the same conference at the same time of the year in next year, because we decided to follow your pattern here and have them in the years when you're not having a conference here. And one of our goals will be, we'll set ourselves a target to get some of that community who are not interested in urban freight to join in with the discussion. So some of the architects, maybe some of the city planners who see it as peripheral to their interests, we want them to be really a big part of being present at that event.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we're going to make sure that people can access information about the International Urban Freight Conference by the URL link that they can see on the screen. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us. at what's been a fascinating discussion. I hope you'll join us around the negotiating table the next time we gather for Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien.